Senator Rennick, then Senator Canavan.
Hi, Dr Foley, how are you going?
I'm very well, thank you.
Look, my questions regard quality assurance of data, and I just want to give you 3 examples, I guess, whereby I just want to raise in terms, because obviously it impacts how we fund data. So the first one was when I first looked into the impact of greenhouse gases on the atmosphere. I was given a number of different energy budgets. One was from the CSIRO and one was from the Australian Academy of Science. Now, in one of the energy budgets, they had a downwelling radiation of 342 regarding greenhouse gases, and the one from the CSIRO had a downwelling radiation of 333 watts per square metre. So there was a difference of 9 watts per square metre in what I was told was from greenhouse gases. Now, in the IPCC paper, it says on page 48 of its 5th report that the increase in downwelling radiation has increased by 2 watts per square metre. So the difference between 2 lots of Australian scientists is a factor of 400% over what the IPCC is claiming. So when I see that, I'm an accountant by trade, sorry, but you know, I look at that and question, well, how accurate, and obviously, you know, you're someone who's measured right down at that micro level, how accurate are our instruments in recording this stuff? Because if we're going to spend money on it, we've got to be able to demonstrate cause and effect and benchmark the outcomes from the money we invest into it.
So first of all, my father was an accountant, so I appreciate the role that you've played, very important. I don't know the details of that, and I won't pretend to try and answer your question scientifically, and maybe it's something we can do later and go through those details.
Yeah, I'd love to. Yep.
But what I think is really important to understand is the way science is done, and that is that it's not a single experiment, it's not a single set of results, it's actually the overall trend that you're looking at. And if I think there's a wonderful quote that comes from David Suzuki, who is a Canadian scientist who's quite famous. And he said that science is not like this, where you have a hypothesis, you do an experiment, and then you cure cancer. We know that what happens is there's many different components that come together. And what we need to do is bring that together in a way that allows us to understand the overall picture, the overall trends. Yes, we need to get into those details in order to make sure that statistically we're on the right track.
Yep.
But one of the things that is tricky is when you're looking at an individual paper on its own, it can actually give you misleading understanding of what's going on. So with that in mind, I'm really keen to see if I can work with you to see if we can tease that out, and it's something we can do at anher time.
I'd love to do it, and I'm glad you raised that, because that brings me to my next question. Was we did a inquiry into the Great Barrier Reef last year, and one of the questions that I raised, and I think it's really important, is do we have a centralised database of all the KPIs on the Great Barrier Reef in one particular place? Because as you well know, the Great Barrier Reef's a massive area.
It's the size of New Zealand.
Lots of different reefs, lots of different KPIs like coral cover, coral growth, seagrass, etc., etc. And I'm pleased to say I am working with Josh Thomas to try and work on this. But the one thing that struck me was the farmers have been asked by the Queensland Government to have a basin management plan, and that's going to cost them thousands of dollars to do, and they have a risk of up to $200,000 in fines, but we don't have a process that demonstrates that the runoff from the river is linked to, you know, impacts on the reef, and we need that cause and effect.
Okay.
And I guess that's another area I think we really need to look at is, and the problem is too, this is also a government problem, it's the Queensland Government that manages the water runoff on land, and it's the federal government that manages the Great Barrier Reef, you know, and the impacts on that. So we've also got a bit of a government problem there, but I think we really need to look at, you know, being the accountant here again, you know, a centralised database year by year of everything that happens in the reef, you know, a database of everything that runs off the river system, and then we can compare to try and demonstrate some cause and effect. Because if the farmers are expected to manage their land and the runoff, then we really need yet again to benchmark our performance to see if what's happening on the land is actually having any result.
So, Senator, one of the things you might be pleased to know about is there's some really great technologies that are being developed. For example, artificial intelligence, machine learning on apps which cane growers in Queensland are able to use, where they're able to measure with sensors in real time what the fertiliser in waterways level, what the levels are, and then be able to have that information collected in this app, and then that gives them advice on how to make sure that they put just the right amount of fertiliser onto the cane fields.
Sure.
And with that, they save money because they don't have to use as much fertiliser, and then they actually use just the right amount. So what we're seeing is other technologies which are really working with agriculture to become a very digital industry, which is really fascinating to see. I think that when it comes to what we're seeing in agriculture, particularly what's needed on land, and then how that flows into impacts for the Great Barrier Reef, are actually going to be seen where there's going to be a market drive for that, because it will for the farmers on land, if they're able to control what they're using.
Yeah, absolutely.
They will actually, it'll be a win-win.
And I totally agree. But it's important that we can measure the improvements in that runoff, or the decrease in runoff, whatever it may be, so that we can say, well done, farmers. What you're doing is working. It might be somewhere else that the problem lays. And then just the last one, and this has had a bit of media coverage this week. Over a decade ago, Tim Flannery said that the dams would never fill again. There was going to be droughts and everything, and as a result of that, a lot of desalination plants have been built in the last 20 years, and really next to no dams have been built in Australia for the last 30 years. And I think this week's shown that we could have really done with a few more dams and a few less desalination plants. So I guess when we have high-profile scientists coming out making alarmist predictions, we need to be careful about that as well. I'm not saying that's your thing, but it's just something that,
We'll take that
as a comment.
Comment
Cheers,
rather than a
thanks.
question.
Okay, thank you.